Hello. In this video, we're going to go over how to create a to-do list app. The purpose of this to-do list app will be to collect information about a new to-do that the user wants to accomplish, store that information in memory, and then re-render the current to-do list to the page. We're going to start with a very basic implementation of that, and then we're going to build onto it in a subsequent video. Inside of here, our first goal is going to be just that first bit. We're going to create a form by which the user can give information to us. When that is submitted, we are going to add a new entry into a list of entries that we have so far in memory. And then we are going to go ahead and every time that that list changes, we're going to re-render it to the page. So let's start with that. This is going to be implemented purely in JavaScript and HTML. There's not going to be any React or anything extra to it. This is going to be as basic as possible. Inside of here, I'm going to start by creating my index.html page. This index.html page is going to house my main page for my app, and in fact, in this app, it's going to be the only page. We call it index.html because most web servers are set up by default to serve index.html whenever somebody requests your website. Inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and, since I'm in VS Code, I'm going to use a shortcut to populate all of what I want for some basic boilerplate for an HTML page. If you're not using VS Code, you can also just take a look at what it creates and put that inside of your project. In order to create it inside of VS Code, I'm going to go ahead and put an exclamation point, and we see immediately that that pops up as an autocomplete. I can either click that with my mouse or I can hit tab, either one. It'll cause all of this to pre-populate. This is that boilerplate that I was referring to, and we only really care about one part of it. Down here on line 7, I'm going to go ahead and call it the to-do list. So if I save this, now I want to have some way to render this inside of a browser so I can see what I'm working on. I'm using the live server extension. In order to get this in VS Code, go ahead and click on extensions, look up live server, and click the install button. Oh, looks like let's see, I think I uninstalled it in order to demonstrate this. Hold on just a moment. Reload. Yeah, that go live is gone. Right, that's what I did. Okay, so here's exactly what you would do. You click on these, you go over here, type in live server pops up as the first one, make sure that it looks like this, and I'll click install. All right, now why did I get that? Let me show you real quick. This project is just using static files. That is to say, these are the files right now. It's the file that will be rendered inside of the browser when a request is sent off to this project or wherever this project is hosted. Right now, I do not have a server in order to serve these files because it's just the HTML file. There's nothing fancy to it. So I'm going to go ahead and have VS Code create a server that serves my files. It's a good idea to do this, especially when you're working with projects that reference external files, because some systems will give you trouble when you don't have a server that's specifically serving it. So if you try to open it directly inside of the browser instead of having it open through a server, you could wind up with it not getting some of the files that you need. Anyway, so on here, I'm going to go ahead and now that I have that installed, I'll right-click my index.html and click Open with Live Server. VS Code is going to start that up on port 5500 for me, and there we go. Over here on 127.0.0.1, which if you're familiar with localhost, that ought to be localhost as well, we have localhost :5500/index.html. If we pop this open real quick, we can see inside of the elements over here, by the way, that was Control-Shift-J that I did, but you can also right-click anywhere on the page and click Inspect if you want another way to open it. Here's the page that we have so far. Ignore this. This is injected by live server to make it so that it automatically refreshes when you make changes. But inside of here, you see that we have our boilerplate, as well as that title that I changed. And up here, we see the title reflected. All right, I'm going to leave this open so we can poke at it if we want to see things on the page inside of that view. So, to our body, which is the main chunk of our page, we want to add a form. so that we can collect information from the user. So this is step 1 of the functionality. This form is going to house all of the elements that we need in order to collect information from the user. The first one that we're going to make is an input, and that lives inside of a label. So let's talk about these real quick. If you're unfamiliar with HTML, you'll notice that I followed 2 patterns here. There are 2 categories of tags. One of them has an opening tag and a corresponding closing tag. And one of them has an opening tag with a slash at the end of it. The elements that have an opening and a closing tag have an opening and closing tag because they can take children inside of them. So a label allows you to put, and a form, and a body allows you to put something inside of them. But an input has a custom bit of rendering, which makes it so that you can't add something directly inside of it as a child. Over here for the label, I can add the input, and I can add, let's go ahead and say to do, new to do. If I save that and head back over to my page, here we go. Inside of my form, I have a label that has the text of new to do along with the input next to it. This input, however, if I tried to give it something inside of it, because, we can type inside of it, so isn't that something inside of it? You're not wrong, however, that's stored in a specific spot. Let me go ahead and show you. If I try to put something inside of this input like I did for the label, it'll show up after it. So if we pop this back open, it says new to do input and then something. So it did not actually add it inside of the input, it added it after it. And that's the browser going through and going, hey, you tried to do something that doesn't really make sense, so I'm going to do the next best thing. I'm going to try to make it make sense. So if this is a self-closing element, it is because it cannot take children directly. Well, then how do we get the value inside of there if we want to add one ourselves? Exactly that. We create a value property on an input in order to assign something inside of it. And there we go. Now you can still change it. That's just the value that shows up when the page first loads. That being said, we won't typically set something inside of here using the HTML because we want to be able to retrieve the user input from there. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that out of there. And as a response to the unasked question of how do I know if it's if it's a self-closing tag or not, well, it just has to do with the given element. If it can take children, it's most likely because it doesn't have any special rendering. And if it can't take children, it's because it has some sort of special rendering. So this input has this box with the stuff inside of it. It's got its own way of rendering itself that doesn't take children into account. Whereas the label allows you to put children inside of it because it will render those children inside of it. So, rule of thumb is, does it have its own rendering type? If so, it does not take children. Input, images, you just have to know what the list is. For right now, we're dealing with form, label, and input, so form takes children, label takes children, input does not. All right, so why did I put this input inside of this label? Well, there's a couple of different ways to do this. If I put it after it, which kind of makes more semantic sense, right? Because, okay, this is the label, it's got the text inside of it, and this label is for this input. Well, there's a little HTML feature where we can link up a label to a particular input. By default, if we have this format with a label and then an input after it, nothing happens. You see, if I click this new to do, I'm not focusing this input. But if I give this a for property, let's say this is to do dash content, and I give this guy an ID property, I am now telling this label that it is a label for the element on the page that has the ID of to do content. So now if I click on this, my cursor shows up over here and we focus this input. That wasn't happening just a second ago when I didn't have the for property on there. Excuse me. So that being said, that is one way to do it, but it takes a little bit of setup. If I want to trim this down a bit, I can just tuck this input inside of here, and it intuitively goes, okay, so this input lives inside of this label must be for this input, and the same functionality goes off. It's a small piece of functionality, but it's an important one to know for user experience, because a user might click here and expect this to be focused. That being said, so now we have our form with our input in it with its label. Let's go ahead and create a button so that the user can confirm to us that they would like to submit what's on our form. I'm going to create a button, which is not a self-closing tag, so it has children inside of it. We add the text that we want to see on the button inside. Let me go ahead and save that, and there she is. We wind up with a button after our label and input. When this is clicked, by default in HTML, a button goes over to the form that it is inside of, if it is in fact inside of a form, and it triggers that form's submission routine. So, if I click this, it's going to cause this form to submit. Let me demonstrate that real quick. Take a look at this URL. Notice that specifically there is no question mark after this index.html. If I click it, there's a little question mark, and you'll see a couple of things went off. You saw a little flicker over here. You saw a little refresh go off over here. And that has to do with the fact that we are submitting another request. We'll get into that when we get into the JavaScript section, but suffice to say that is the default behavior for a form when submitted. So we can tell that the button is submitting the form. All right, so we've got some way to collect the user's input. Now, where are we going to put it? We're going to go ahead and create a UL, or an unordered list, and I'm going to demonstrate what an entry will look like inside of it by creating an LI, or a list item. Let's go ahead and say that the user so far told us that they need to feed their goldfish. We're going to create a list item inside of our unordered list, which just means we're going to have a dot instead of a 1, 2, and 3, say if we had an ordered list. That has the content of the to-do inside of it. All right. So now we know what it should look like. This isn't actually going to show up on the page by default. We're going to use JavaScript in order to create something that looks like this with the user's input inside of it. And just for good measure, let's make it look pretty. We're going to add a heading above it, an H1 specifically, that says this is our to-do list. So that'll just put this up here above our whatever our items are. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. And by the way, a shortcut in VS Code in order to comment something out is Control or Command if you're on a Mac, /. It will apply an appropriate comment depending on what you're inside of. So HTML uses this structure for a comment where it says less than exclamation mark dash dash and then dash dash greater than at the end of it. But JavaScript uses 2 slashes or /*, rather than having to worry about what context you're inside of. If you use Control/, you'll always see the right one show up. All right, let's get into our JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and create a script.js file over here. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to connect this via our index.html to what the user is seeing inside of the browser. And we're not going to do anything fancy in it too quickly. We're just going to make sure that that connection is correct. So inside of this script.js, I'm going to console.log hi. And I urge you to do things like this. Take it one step at a time. Make sure that everything is connected as you go along, because you don't want to get to the end of making this big, giant piece of logic and then figure out that it's not running at all. So, connecting in your bits and pieces is just as important as making sure that the bits and pieces are functional. Because if you don't turn the car on, you're not going anywhere. So, I'm going to make sure, by putting this console.log of hi, that the script is being loaded up. Over in my HTML, which is the focus for a HTML JavaScript project, I'm going to go ahead and create a script tag that has the src, or the source of script.js. Now I've put this script.js in the root of the project along with index.html, so I don't have to do anything fancy with the pathing here, and we just reference it by name. Let's go ahead and take a look at the page and see if we're seeing our console.log. Over here, we were looking at the element section before. I'm going to switch over to the console section. Yep, we get a console.log of hi and script.js on line 1. She's doing exactly what we expect her to. Over here now, I want to change what's happening inside of the script.js. I know that it's executing, but now I want it to start branching out into what we wanted to do functionally. I would like it to go over and find this form on the page, because our first step for our functionality in the JavaScript side of things is going to be to select this form and to listen to when it is submitted. So when the user submits this form, we want to do something. All right, but how do I get a reference to that? There are a couple of different ways to do it. I'm going to go ahead and add an ID to this. An ID inside of an HTML page ought to be unique. That is to say, nobody else should have the ID of form-to-do. I could give this h1 an ID, but it better be anything other than a form-to-do. So, this ID of form-to-do, I'm going to go ahead and use it to reference that element inside of my script.js. And this, spoilers, is going to lead to an error, but I'll show you the error and then how to fix it so we know exactly what's going on. I'm going to create a new variable named formElement, and I'm going to assign it to document.getElementById, which intuitively we might assume means go to the HTML document and find the element on the page that has the ID of form-to-do in our case. Now, just like I did with the console.log of hi, I'm going to console.log formElement to make sure that this is going off correctly. Again, good idea to do these steps because null. Now, what? That doesn't make any sense. Let me go ahead and pull this over here. We know that there is an element on the page that has the ID of form-to-do. And we know that we've said, go ahead and get element by ID form-to-do. It's right there. JavaScript. Why don't you see it? That has to do with how HTML loads. It loads sequentially. So we load this line, and this line, and this line, and this line, etc. We get down to this line. We not only load in the script.js file, but we also execute it. So at this point, when this tag is loaded in, this guy doesn't exist yet. He comes in a little bit later after the body and then the form. So there are a couple of different ways to do this. And just to demonstrate the most common that you'll probably run into, you can put your script tag anywhere underneath the item that it's referencing. And if you're going to do it that way, a good rule of thumb is to put it right above the closing body tag. By doing that, you make sure that, all right, let's go ahead and save. This script is loaded in and executed after this element is added to the page. All right, so we get our console.log. But I'm going to show you a more modern way to do it. This is good to know, but this is what I am going to use. I'm going to simply add a defer property to the script tag. What this does is it says, go ahead and load in script.js, but defer execution of that file's contents until after the entire HTML page has been loaded. So same idea. Why do I prefer / suggest this over adding it to the end right before the closing body tag? Well, because it allows me to keep all of my meta information or anything that doesn't have to explicitly do with the HTML that I'm putting on the page up here inside of my head element. And I far prefer that because it means I don't have to scroll down to the bottom of my file in order to find my script tags. I can just pop open my file and very quickly say, okay, this guy here. This is the script.js that I've loaded in. Or I can see that it's not there. Now, why would I care? We've only got 24 lines. Well, therein lies the rub. What if you have something like 1,129 lines? I don't want to have to scroll down to the end of that file. So I'm going to go ahead and keep them up here so it's really easy to find it. It also feels like a better practice to me. Other people might have other opinions on it. Most people will have the opinion that it should go up above the body because that's how it's been done for so long. That's why I'm mentioning that this is a more modern way of doing it. There's also things to be said that if your script is too large and it's loading here before your page, that could cause delays. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I'm not going to say one way or the other. I tend to deal in smaller scripts, and that's usually a better practice because then you just don't experience it one way or the other. But and to be executed after the document has been parsed but before firing DOM content loaded. Scripts with a defer attribute will prevent blah blah blah. This attribute must not be used. Dabba dabba doo. You know, I'm not gonna guess. So, suffice to say, if I keep it up here and say defer, we still get our form here, and I'll refresh it for good measure. So there it goes. This is the style that I prefer. This is the style that I'm going to recommend, but also you can put it down here without the defer if you'd like. So we've got this. We can see that our reference to the form element is what we expect it to be. It is this form right here, and if we hover over it, it shows us the blue outline on the page that it's that guy over there. So we want to add an event listener to this. I'm going to go ahead and say form element.add event listener, submit, and I'm going to create a function. Let's talk about what this looks like real quick. We have our reference to our form element, and I want to listen to some event whenever it goes off. In JavaScript, we have this nice event system that listens for some things to happen on elements. I want to listen for when this form is submitted. Pretty intuitive, right? And when the submission goes off, I want to run this function that's going to do something about it. All right. I'm going to accommodate an FAQ here based off of really what is an error that some students usually experience first. Why don't we just listen to the button to be clicked? Because that's what the user is going to do, right? They're going to type something inside of here and then click the Add To Do button. Well, not necessarily. That's not the only thing that causes the form to submit, and that's where people get caught up. You can submit the form by clicking the button that has the type of submit, which they all do by default, inside of the form. But you can also submit the form by hitting enter inside of an input. And if you are only listening to the click event on the button, that means you are not listening to everything that can cause the submission of the form. So best practice and the best idea here is to attach a submit event listener directly to the form that you're looking for. All right, so I want to be able to handle the submission of the form by accessing the information inside of the form. For our purposes, we want to access whatever the user has typed inside of this input. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and say console.log hi. I just want to make sure that this is threaded through properly. And some people are going to recognize right off the bat that this is going to cause an error. Again, I want to show that this is going to cause the error and then show how to fix it. So over here, if I submit the form, we saw the console.log hi really quick. Let me do it again. Keep an eye over here. And then it went away. So what happened? A lot of my students refer to this as the submission of the form caused the page to refresh. And we don't want that to happen. Really what it's doing is it's making another request. Every form element by default has an action property as well as a, method property. The method property is given the value of get, and the action is given the value of, I don't know if it's an empty string or a slash to be fair, but what it's saying is that when the form is submitted, it is going to send some sort of request off to a server at this path. So we don't want that to happen in our context because we are handling the submission of a form in JavaScript. So let's dive into this function a bit in order to figure out how to solve that. As this function is being passed in as an event listener, it gets access to an object describing the event as it went off. On that event, specifically when dealing with the submission of a form inside of JavaScript, we want to prevent the default behavior. So we're going to call event.preventDefault. Again, the browser has that default behavior of submitting that request. Let's go ahead and get rid of this question mark to demonstrate. Off to whatever path it's been given. But we want to stop it and say, no, don't do that. Because we're going to handle the submission of the form inside of our JavaScript. So over here, if I do ASD now and hit add to do, or even if I hit enter while focused inside of here, we get the console.log of hi. You see that there's two because I clicked the button and then hit enter inside of the input, and there's no question mark. We didn't send a subsequent request. We didn't lose where we currently were. So we prevented the default, the browser didn't do what it wanted to do, and now we can see our console.log at high. So we can have what we want to go off without losing our spot inside of JavaScript. So down here, I want to get access to the value inside of this input when this form is submitted. There's a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can follow suit with what we were doing before by setting an ID onto this input, but I like to stay away from IDs as much as possible because they have some restrictions to them. Namely, we want to only have one unique ID per page, or that's a weird way to say that. We can't reuse an ID. So we don't want to wind up with a giant list of IDs that we're using. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and give it a name property. We're going to call it content. Now, let me show you, just by taking event default off here for a second, why we're going to use the name property specifically. Let's go ahead and say that the user wanted to feed their goldfish. If I click add to do, and that event.prevent default isn't on, and I submit the form, the browser is going to do what it does by default. If we take a look at the URL, we are now at index.html content equals, and then what was inside of that element on the form for the value, now that we have a name by that name. So we say content equals feed goldfish, which is what I put inside of there. This is how the browser would typically send that request off. We are going to fit in line with what the browser's normal method of execution is as close as possible, but we're going to add our own logic. This is generally a good practice when overriding logic, that you stick as close to the original as possible while still adding in your own logic, because you get to benefit from the perks that were already introduced for that process. In this case, the perk that we're able to access is whenever an input is given a name and it lives inside of a form, JavaScript goes, all right, so if you have a reference off to this form, you'll be able to ask for that reference dot whatever the name is in order to access that input. Let me demonstrate what I mean here real quick. We're going to go ahead and say console.log form element dot content. We're going to change this in a bit, but for right now we'll use this. So if I say feed goldfish, add to do, we get a console.log of the input with the name of content, and in Chrome, if we hover over it, we can see that input is highlighted. So, and we got that just because we said form element dot whatever the name was. Without this name there, if we attempt to, let me go ahead and get rid of that query string there. Let's feed goldfish again. We don't have that connection. So we'll add the name of content to that. That allows us to talk about the element itself. But this is generally a bad practice here, or there is a better practice. We want to talk about, when we're inside of this function, we don't necessarily want to talk about this global variable if we don't have to. We want to talk about the information that is given to us on the event. We want to get the target of that event. The reason for this, so let's go ahead and console.log event.target, is that we might want to reuse this function in the future. So we're making it so that regardless of which form was submitted, we're targeting that one. When the event is passed through, if we access the target, we are accessing the event or the element upon which that event went off. So in this case, we're adding the submit event listener to this form element, so event.target in this context will always be form element. But in the future, you might come across something where we have a couple of different things that we want to attach the same event listener to, but we want to see something go off contextually for that particular element. Without getting too mystic there, because we don't have we're not going to go over an example of that in this context, let me go ahead and show you. If I click submit, I'm not even going to add anything to it now. We have the form with the ID of form to do, so we know that the event.target is the same as our form element. Just a slightly better practice. We now want to combine those two things that we were talking about here in order to access the content property. So we're going to say event.target.content, and if we head over here, exactly what we're looking for. So event.target.content is going to get us access to the target form. Oh, no. Let's peel that off one. So the target form is going to be event.target const content input equals target form dot content. So we're going to combine those two things we were just talking about. And if we console.log content input, get out there, save, we go over here, there she is. Okay, now I'll show you in a second why we pulled it out into two separate variables, but first, we just want to get the value. When we console.logged the content itself, we got a reference to the input. We want whatever is inside of the input. In this case, we want that ASD. So we are going to get the value property that we referred to earlier. So if I do feed goldfish inside of here now and click add to do, I get feed goldfish. That's what we've been looking to get. So we've added a submit event listener to the form. When it's submitted, then we console.log whatever was inside of its content input. Let's go ahead and what do we want to do? Well, we want to collect that inside of a list. So I'm going to create a list. In JavaScript, we refer to them as arrays called to-dos. To start, it's going to be an empty array. Every time we add or submit the form, we'll add a new entry to that to-dos. In JavaScript, we can use the push function on any given array in order to add an element to the end of it. I'm going to push the content inside of the value of the content input into my array. And let's just go ahead and show what that looks like as it goes off. If I say feed goldfish, we start off with an array of feed goldfish. Let's go ahead and feed the cat. Now we have feed goldfish and feed cat. Let's go ahead and feed the dog. Feed goldfish, feed cat, feed dog. You get the idea. We're keeping a list of elements that are entries that have been submitted so far. Now, after that mutation goes off, after we add that entry to the end of to-dos, I would like to render the list onto the page. So here's our second phase here. We've collected the information and we're keeping a store of it as we go along. Now we want to cause that store to render something to this UL, something that looks like this, so we get our LIs as we go along. In order to do that, I'm going to make another function. Let's call it render list. That's going to be invoked after we're done pushing the new entry to the end of the to-dos. Inside of this, for each element inside of the to-dos list, I want to build a list item on the page. I want to create an LI, I want to tuck that content into it, and I want to tuck that onto my UL. The first thing that I recognize inside of there is that for each element inside of this array, I want to do something. So I'm going to go ahead and say to-dos.forEach, and inside of there, I'm going to say I want to render a list item for every element inside of there, which is going to be another function that I'm going to make down here that is going to receive one item inside of this array at a time as a result of for each. So for each underneath the hood iterates over every element inside of the array and passes it through to a call to the function that we've provided, this callback function. This callback function of render list item, right now let's go ahead and just console.log the item that it receives so you can see that it's getting one at a time. Over here, if I say feed goldfish, I get feed goldfish. If I say feed cat, I get feed goldfish and feed cat. If I say feed dog, I get feed goldfish, feed cat, feed dog. So every time I submit it, it is console.logging the contents of the array one at a time. That's the kind of thing that we want to see when we're building this LI, because we want to create one of them for each entry inside of the array. Excuse me. So for each entry inside of the array, I want to create a new LI element. Let's go ahead and say document.create element in order to do that. And we're creating an LI element. So we give the tag name inside of the create element as a string. This LI element is going to create an LI like this, but in memory. So it doesn't exist on the page yet, but it's created a theoretical one that we can toy with. So this li element, the only thing that I want to do to it is I want to set its inner text to item. Now, some of you may come from a background where you use inner HTML. If you do, stop. Don't use inner HTML unless you absolutely have to, and you know what will be injected onto the page as a result. You can wind up with some cross-site scripting attacks. You can wind up with some vulnerabilities in your app if you do that. So I'm going to use inner text. We're going to set the inner text of this li element to whatever the text for the item is, which is whatever the item is, because remember, we're storing an array of these strings. So we're going to create the li, we're going to tuck whatever we were console.logging just a moment into it, and now, like I said, it doesn't exist on the page yet, but let's go ahead and add it to the page. In order to do that, I'm going to need to build a reference to this UL, just like I built a reference to this form. So I'm going to follow the same suit. I'm going to say form dash list dash to do. Up here, I'll go ahead and clone this underneath itself because it'll be much the same thing. Let's say list element equals list dash to do. Here, I want to list element dot append child. So I'm telling the list, this UL, that it needs to add a new item to itself, the one that we've been building inside of this li element in memory. All right. So to cover what we just did again, this form element submit is going to create a new entry inside of our list. After we perform that operation, we are going to invoke this renderList function. This renderList function is responsible for going through our current list and calling renderListItem with that entry inside of the list. RenderListItem is responsible for receiving that entry, building an li, setting its inner text to whatever the user gave us, and then adding that to the end of our current list. Some people may be able to predict the error that's about to happen here or the undesired operation that's about to happen here. Again, I'm going to create the issue before I create the solution. So over here, if I say feed goldfish, add to do, all right. So we have the basic functionality of this. If I feed the goldfish, or if I say I want to add the to do of feed goldfish, it pops up over here. Let's go ahead and feed the cat. Here's the error. We're feeding the goldfish twice. But why? Well, we've only been additive. Every time we call renderList, we are adding new LIs to the end of the list element, but we didn't clear out the previous ones. So each time we're going over the entire list. Now we can do this one of two ways. We could optimize that we're not going over every item inside of the list, but for this exercise, we're going to re-render the entire list every time. So how do we make it so that we don't get stuck with old renderings? Well, remember how I just said don't use inner HTML? Unless you know exactly what you're going to put inside of there. We're going to set the inner HTML of the list element to an empty string. So list element is this whole UL, and we're saying everything inside of you, clear it out. And then add the to-dos. So that's where the LIs would live when they're created by each iteration. And then each subsequent iteration is going to clear out the elements from the previous iteration. So now if I try this, let's feed our goldfish. Let's feed our cat. That feed goldfish is not the same li that we saw when we initially submitted feed goldfish. It is now the one that was added to the page after we submitted feed cat. So little nuance there, but it makes it so that we don't wind up with our lists repeated. That was happening inside of the console.log as well earlier, but there's no reason to clear them there. So now that we have that, we have nearly the full functionality, or, we've got the full functionality for what we're going to build today. One little thing that I would like to do is whenever the user submits the form, I want this to disappear because it's kind of annoying to have to come back here and say, all right, clear out what's inside of here in order to put the next one. Typically, a good practice for user experience would be to clear this input out after they submit the form. So after they submit the form, so this whole thing right here, once we've retrieved the information that we want from it, we're going to go ahead and say, how did I structure this? Let's pull this out just a bit. Instead of referencing the content input, we're going to reference the value directly here and use content inside of here. So this is going to work the exact same as it did just a moment ago. That was just a quick refactoring. But now, after I retrieve the value from the element, I can say target form.content.value equals an empty set of quotation marks. So we can both read from this value property as well as assign a value into it. When we set the value, then we will clear out when we set it to an empty string, we'll be clearing it out. So if I do feed goldfish, there it goes. Now I can just keep typing. One last thing. Whenever I submit the form, I would also like to, focus this input again so I don't have to click back into it to keep typing. So let's go ahead and feed goldfish and we'll add to do, but you'll see my cursor popped right back inside of the input, regardless of how I submit it. I mean, it's already in there if I just hit enter inside of here, but if I click the add to do, it stays inside of that input. Because beforehand, we're just feeding, my bad. It's not focusing this because this button is what's currently focused. That's the last thing that was focused here. All right, and that completes our logic for this video. We've made it so that we can take in input from the user. We can remember what they've given us so far, and every time they adjust it, we re-render what they see on the page to reflect what they've given us so far. In the next video, we'll go over how to make it so that they can mark it to do as complete, or they can delete an entry on the page. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a great rest of your day.